Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. If you are joining for the first time, this is part of our podcast series in which we invite a guest from the community. And today we have a very special guest. He brings a lot of experience from the not-for-profit government space, financial services. So we are going to have a lot of fun discussing that, peeling a lot of layers in those industries. Before we do that, we are going to start with the quick commentary about different episodes that we have covered. If you have not checked them, go back and check. We always bring very interesting guests from the community who have done the real work in the ERP enterprise architecture space. And we are going to be inviting a lot in the future as well. So stay tuned for those episodes. Generally, they get aired on my feed. So if you don't follow me on LinkedIn, please do. That's where you are going to learn about these episodes. We generally do the interview series. We have different series, different topics that we cover as part of the podcast. This is the interview series. And for this, we meet every Friday, anywhere from 8 to 11 Eastern, depending upon the time zone of the guest. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to you, Doug. Do you want to introduce yourself and your current focus?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Sam. So I'm Doug Kameen. I'm the Chief Information Technology Officer at a nonprofit in the Rochester, New York area called Coordinated Care Services Incorporated. We're work in the mental and behavioral health space. We help governments, state entities, and other nonprofits in their work, helping deliver mental health services, helping provide supports for service delivery and practice transformation, which is really a fancy word for helping them do better at the work that they do. We have a specific focus in areas like trauma-informed and trauma-responsive care, which is a newer idea of taking into account a more holistic approach to how people are treated and handled through the mental health system. And that's something that's a really big focus for us. But we're a pretty big organization in the space that we live in, about 500 employees. And spread geographically, mostly across New York State, but we do work across the country as well. My current focus is really an enterprise transformation with them. Been doing a ton of work since I started a couple of years ago, doing a full revamp of our enterprise architecture, really building an enterprise architecture, to be honest. And putting forward a plan to replace pretty much all of our enterprise systems, as the organization has experienced a pretty significant period of growth from its time about 10 years ago into now.
Okay, very good, Doug. And I have to admit, I don't think we have had anybody so far on the show, and we are 600 episodes down from Rochester, New York.
Yeah.
And you are very close to me, to be completely honest. So this is fun. And I don't know if you guys already have, snow there right now. I mean, we had snow here in Toronto yesterday, which was decent in December.
It was snow pretty good in Rochester. I was driving home. I live a little ways outside of Rochester. I live closer to Binghamton, New York, which is about 2 hours away from Rochester. But on my way home yesterday, it was a snowy travel. As the snow squalls were really rolling through. I will admit, though, that I did make a pit stop at one of the ski places and got in a couple of turns.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
In the morning? Really?
In the evening, late in the day.
I see. Okay.
You plan your afternoon home, the trip home, right?
Yeah.
And I took a couple hours of PTO, and it was opening day for the ski place that I normally ski at. So got a little bit of time in on the slopes, which is nice.
That's awesome. And my recollection, and I don't travel in the area as much as I used to, at least in the winters. And you guys used to get like 6 times, 12 times the snow than what Toronto used to get, as far as my understanding goes. I don't know if that is still the same.
Upstate gets a healthy share of snow. So, the ski place that I go to, it's about 45 minutes from me. They get an average of about 100 to 120 inches of snow a year, which is it's a pretty significant amount of snow. I mean, it's 10 feet of snow every year.
Yeah, it's always awesome, discussing all of these geographies. And sometimes, I mean, geo is going to have some sort of impact on the overarching philosophy of the ERP as well as enterprise architecture, right? So we are going to discuss on that as well. But before we do that, we have one of these standard questions with every single guest. And that is going to be, Doug, the overarching theme of the podcast. This podcast is all about business growth. and growing sort of through technology, ERP, digital transformation. So we are looking for your personal perspective. When you think of business growth, what does it mean to you?
Well, my background is you from your introduction. You mentioned I have a background in government service. I was a county CIO for almost 10 years. I was in the private sector. I built some IT consulting businesses and ran several way back 20 years ago. In the 2000s, back in the aughts. And the idea of business growth for me is conceptually you got to have something to latch onto to move towards at all times. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a government entity, whether you're in a private sector entity, a for-profit business or a not-for-profit organization. Even in my current organization, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the future looks like, in part because if we're going to deliver world-class services that are going to make a difference, we need to have the tools to do that stuff, and do that work. And you're not going to get those tools if you don't have at least some type of growth and some focus on growing that business, growing what you're doing, and trying to do whether it's do better, to capture more revenue, enter a new line of business or a new way to work. All of those things are focuses that we focus on even in the nonprofit space, because we need to. For just to make a quick example, we have we put together a 3-year strategy plan for our organization, and part of that strategy is to build out our management consulting practice, where we help other nonprofits, which is really the biggest component of our management consulting work. And that's a capacity building exercise. And what that means in the nonprofit space is we go to other nonprofits that are delivering services and we help them do those services better or expand their capacity to do those services. So that can take the shape of a lot of different looks. It could look a lot of different ways, I should say. It can be us coming in and showing them efficiencies in the work that they're doing. It can be providing actual supports with staffing and CFO, like virtual CFO type of stuff. Hey, we'll help you with your books. We'll do this other stuff like that. But in all respects, for us, the mission is to help them do better work. So there's always a why in whatever business you're in, whether you're in a public sector business. I mean, if the government, as in the government, working in local counties and serving, regions of constituents, the growth idea behind that was, how do we do this more efficiently so that we can deliver more services that our constituents need and they want, even if the operating environment doesn't allow for us to say, go find a whole bunch of new customers. There's not a bunch of new people moving here. So for me, growth is an inherent part of everything that you do in business, but it does look different at each different way that you each different vertical that you're focused into.
Yeah, it's a very interesting perspective, and in my experience as well, to be completely honest, and it's kind of surprising that you are thinking about growth, because that's not the sentiment that I get when I talk to any of the government or not-for-profit organizations. To be completely honest, in fact, I get a ding, okay, whenever I talk to them and I'm talking about business and growth, and they're like, "Who are you again? We don't talk about business here. We don't grow here." We have not grown. It's going to be a different perspective from their perspective, right?
I would argue that growth to them. So I would argue that growth is a part of what they do, but they might not call it that. And that's an important distinction, is that they say like, oh, well, we're the geography, take a county, the geographies of a county, and at least in the United States, the geographies of a county are fixed. They don't really change. So short of somebody moving in or moving out, things don't change as far as the constituents go. But that doesn't mean that the service needs don't change. That doesn't mean that the makeup of the constituents hasn't altered in some way. Maybe there's more people who are poorer and need more supports. Maybe there's been a change in crime and other things like that. So you have to grow different services at different times and at different rates. So I would just argue that growth is different. People may not call it that.
Could not agree more. Could not. Great points. So we are going to come back to that. I'm going to speak to the audience just for a second. So guys, if you are, they are listening, we would love to hear where you are joining from, and if you have any sort of comments, experiences related to this, we always like to create this three-way conversation, even though you might not be part of the conversation, but you are sort of part of the conversation. So make sure you guys share those. We are going to bring those, here as well, in terms of, what you are seeing. So on that note, Doug, I'm going to go back to your comments. And one of the trends that we see in the not-for-profit and government space, um, and the comment that you had made related to the management consulting, okay, and this is not the first time I have heard something like this in the not-for-profit government space. I'm in Canada. So in Canada as well, they have roughly 200, 300 different government organizations. They do different things, right? But they also have very similar model as shared services. You guys are calling management consulting. The concept is very similar, from their perspective as well. It might not be as much management consulting. You might be doing a little bit of more strategy work, I guess. But the business model is very similar in terms of how they are sort of interacting with the other government entities. And the point that I'm trying to bring is the not-for-profit and the government spaces could be so uniquely different. And I don't know if this is because they are trying to do whatever they can do in their power. And sometimes because of that, the business processes are not going to be as streamlined. And that makes it a challenge, because if you're looking for any sort of enterprise software categories, ERPs, they don't sort of fit in. And, the business model is always changing. So maybe share a little bit of, perspective on that, what you have seen in the government not-for-profit space and the challenges that you have seen compared to for-profit.
Sure. So in the government space, when you look at business process, you look at the tools you're using and things of that nature. A lot of times, the government has to invest in a tool, and then it has to use it to its not just useful end, but its bitter end. Yeah. And you'll see that a lot. Hey, look, when I started at the county that I was CIO for a long time, as 8 years there, we were still using an AS400, an IBM AS400, and we had a homegrown ERP system built on that. So we had hired programmers in the 90s. This was, 15, 20 years before I ever started working there, but they hired some programmers, and that was the thing you did. You could hire programmers. They could write some software for you. It was, there was a bunch of code that was off the shelf. And, you could bring those types of tools in or build those types of tools. But by the time I started, the methodology had changed. There was vertical tools that focus on this space. So you could go buy a software package, and the complexity of maintaining it had moved beyond the capacity of most government entities, whether they were mid-size or even large-size organizations. So one of the key differences, though, is how you end up using those tools. So in a government, the service to the constituencies is usually the paramount consideration, and the consistency of the service delivery is prioritized over pretty much anything else. So as a consequence, you often see people like to kind of joke about this a little bit, but you'll see government websites that'll use what appear to be older technologies and things that they're hanging on to. And there's two sides to that, to how they get there. One would be a lack of investment, so you can make a case that they didn't invest when they needed to and things like that. The other side is the idea that they need to carry an investment to its logical end. Yeah. So something it'll live longer in a government entity than it will in a private sector entity, because the motivations for what makes you need to change are just inherently different. So in a government service space, I'm going to use that tool as long as possible to maximize the investment of public dollars that we put into it. And that's really the driving overarching goal of what you're trying to do, versus a private sector entity. Even the nonprofit that I'm in, we're a nonprofit organization, but we are a private organization. So at some point, we come to a point with the tools where we look at them and we say, you know what, this is going to impede our next stages of growth. It's going to impede the next initiatives that we want to engage in. And as a consequence, we're going to leave that behind. But we also have the luxury of making choices like, you know what, that business line that we're in, we're just not going to do that anymore. It's lower margin, or it's really hard to do. We're not winning business there. So we're just going to exit that space. And, the tools that go with it can exit with it. But when I'm a county and, say here in the United States, you have like a county clerk. County clerk records deeds, records property transactions, stuff like that. It's not something that goes away. I can't just be like, what, the county clerk business kind of sucks today. So we'll just not do that anymore and have somebody else take it over. So you have a lot of different drivers that make for really different business decisions. And I think I am a supporter of, having worked in the government. I know what it's like to be a public servant and to have to make those decisions. It's kind of easy to be making some of it into a punching bag. Oh, look, they're using this old technology. Oh, look, they're doing this stuff like that. Some of it is actually absolutely legitimate. There were political considerations that were short-sighted at times about the investments that should have been made. But more often than not, it isn't the short-sightedness that gets the government to where it is. It's more often the desire or the need to maximize that investment and maximize what they've spent and hold on to that until the bitter end. Now, there's a real fine tipping point there. You can hold on to the bitter end and you can hold on too long. And when you hold on too long, then you got problems.
Yeah, so very interesting. And I'm going to share some experiences from my perspective, to be completely honest. Obviously, we do a lot of work in the for-profit space. In my personal experience, especially when you compare and contrast this with the mid-sized organizations. If you're looking for enterprises, it might be slightly different because they have been doing IT for a long time. They might have a lot of maturity in their organizations. But if you look at SMBs, they just don't know what they don't know, to be completely honest. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
For them, any sort of software implementation is like buying a widget from Home Depot. That's how they think. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard, with them. But in my personal experience, when I look at any of the government organizations, and I don't know whether the driver comes from the public dollars, that could be a possibility, that they are being scrutinized a little bit more. If they fail, then they are probably going to be accountable for that. I don't know if that could be a possibility. So maybe you can share a little bit more perspective there, where the driver is coming from. But in my personal experience, they seem to be slightly mature in terms of planning the kind of RFPs that they are releasing. Sometimes those RFPs could be tricky because they still have to comply with the framework. And sometimes that framework, you might not be able to shoehorn everything the way you want, because sometimes you are doing this for people because that's how they like to see things. Even if you might not agree with them, you still have to sort of follow those guidelines. So when I look at those RFPs, they seem to be slightly more planned, structured. They might not make as much sense. Let's say if I'm the CIO or you are the CIO looking at those, but still they seem to be slightly more planned. So do you share similar experience as well, that, in the not-for-profit government space, they are going to be slightly more mature overall from the IT maturity perspective, even in these smaller organizations?
Well, smaller organizations usually, I think your description, I would classify it as accurate. That most small organizations really don't have the ability to be as sophisticated in some of their IT operations and how they think, and that's something. I do some co-hosting on another podcast where we talk to IT leaders and about their journeys and their leadership, how they've grown and what makes them leaders. But one of the key things that comes up pretty regularly, because we're often talking to mid-market folks, is that an organization, when an organization starts new, the first things you always have a finance person. You always then the next hire you really build into is an HR function. The IT function comes much later, and it's much easier to farm out the IT function for quite a while into the organization, including pretty far into the mid-market space. It's pretty difficult to farm out most of the finance space. It's pretty difficult to farm out the HR space, although there's some organizations that are really trying. So as a consequence, the way, and this is, they come back to the podcast that I host, but this is a common conversation that we have with the leaders about the ones who have grown from small organizations into mid-market or larger organizations, is that they see the early stages are where they don't have a lot of sophisticated IT. They're relying on external sources. Those sources have different profit motives and different reasons for giving them, different advice. Not to say that they're not interested in helping them, but they're their own businesses too. So they have, they've got their own things to worry about how they're doing the business. But as you mature into a mid-market organization, you typically add in the IT function. And when you internalize your IT function, you start maturing a lot of the activities that happen in there. So things like, let's look more closely at why we're doing stuff. Let's make plans that are shared amongst the executive leadership of the organization, and build plans going forward. And then they, depending on the type of organization and how they look, they bring the IT function closer to the senior leadership. So, in my organization, I report to the CEO, and that's, I always call that uncommon, but that's not, there's a couple different ways that the IT function usually reports. The most common, I would say, is probably through a COO.
Yeah.
And maybe the second most common is probably through like a CFO in a smaller mid-market organization. But if your organization finds that the IT function of the organization is critical to its business success, then you'll typically find that or at least it's necessary, I find it necessary for the IT function to report directly to the CEO and to have a seat at the senior leadership table, and not work through, say, a COO or a CFO who have different motives about the organization's ideas, like what's most important to the senior leadership in that day. So I can see there's a journey as organizations grow from small to mid-market in particular, and really large, and there's also a sweet spot, if you will, in there too, where you want to be large enough to have sophisticated IT operations. It's great to have staff. It's great to have diverse staff with some backup, but you can also get to a point where the organization becomes so large, and it moves into larger organizations where the bureaucracy of the organization starts weighing down its ability to make moves and operate nimbly. So that's another pretty common conversation that I've had with a bunch of folks, is especially people who worked at publicly traded companies and things. Then they come back to a mid-market organization, and they're so shocked they're like, oh my God, like, this is great. I come here and
how are you running?
I'm just like, you know what? Today we should, we're going to subscribe 50 people to Microsoft Copilot today, or we're going to buy ChatGPT or whatever the du jour is. But you can make that decision versus, they're like, in my prior organization, that was 6 levels of approval, and I had to go through like an enterprise architecture committee or something like that, and it would take 6 weeks to get that approval unless it was the CEO's prerogative that day.
Yeah. Yeah, so very interesting. It's always fun to talk about organizational structure because they do vary a lot. So let's touch a little bit more on that in terms of what is your perspective. Let's say if you were the CEO, how you are going to design depending upon different organizations. So one of the comments that you mentioned, and that is probably one of the most controversial debates, I guess, in the IT community. In any community, I guess everybody wants to sort of report to the CEO in general because that's where they are going to get a lot of freedom. But at least from my perspective, I always like to look at the overarching sort of business strategy in terms of what business is trying to accomplish, what role every single department is sort of going to play. And if I look at any of the cross-functional organizations, cross-functional departments probably a right word there, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of the whole cross functionality, can I use that word? I don't know.
We'll run with it.
So you are going to have operations, you are going to have finance. I think you did mention that. You are going to have HR. They are supposed to be sort of the department. Maybe HR, maybe cross-functional, because wherever you are going to touch people, you probably would require some sort of HR presence, and that's why we have sort of the HR business partners. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we see those, right?
Oh yeah, we've got a couple in our organization.
Right. In your organization, the industries that you are working with, I don't know how common supply chain is going to be. In product-centric industries, the supply chain is very common as well. That sort of interweaves with the organization, different departments. They are slightly more cross-functional as well. I don't know any other departments that are going to be as cross-functional as IT, and that is something that people don't understand. Okay, if you are going to pigeonhole your IT inside if you report through a COO, That's operations. CEO is not comped the way their compensation structure is going to be, the way their budget is going to be, to take care of the issues of the other departments, I guess. I mean, not everybody's reporting through a CEO unless the CEO is just a blanket wrapper there who's simply doing the external communication. So, and the same thing goes for the CFO as well. I mean, CFO is responsible for finance and accounting. Yes, they are going to touch everything from the dollar perspective, but not every interaction in the organization is going to be a dollar interaction, I guess. So that would be my take. So do you have any sort of follow-up comments on based on I spoke a lot there, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I think I would emphasize that there's no one size fits all structure for any organization. And so like in our organization, we find that the efforts in our technology space are a critical component of what differentiates us as an organization. So as a result, it's believed that, we make the belief that the IT function should stand alone at the senior executives table. But if your job is to, and I'll oversimplify this just for the sake of a brief conversation, but if your job is to build, X widget, and if there's a factory going on and the widget really doesn't have a lot of technical components to it, which is could again be oversimplified because pretty much every widget now has some sort of technical component. But let's say it's a relatively non-technical component, and you just need to move the stuff along. So in that case, really an IT can make sense working in reporting to an operations role. So it really depends on the type of organization, what the organization is valuing, or maybe more importantly, what the organization sees as its most critical functions for success. So if IT and technological prowess is a key factor in driving success, then that's oftentimes where you see the IT functions and the leaders in the IT functions become elevated to the same levels as other C-level executives.
Yeah, could not agree more. So let's go back to the whole comment about the evolution of different organizations. And one of the comments that you had mentioned that, hey, initially, any small organizations, they are going to start with finance. You have to have that. You are probably not going to have as many people in the organization. So, HR is probably going to be slightly delayed. I think you did mention that, right? But let's say if you look at least in 2024, now you can get SaaS applications for pretty much everything. In my personal experience, Doug, finance is going to be, that does not touch the actual transactions, meaning that does not touch the experience. If you're sure, some people argue that, if you are going to take maybe a month in closing your books, that's probably too bad. I get it. But that is still not the experience part, the experience that any organization is going to serve, especially from the not-for-profit government space. When people are waiting, I don't know, let's say if you're a government organization and you are trying to pay your property taxes, and if that is going to take maybe 5 days or 7 days or 20 days, then people are probably not going to be happy about it, right? And that is something that you need to address, because that is the experience that they're looking for. Now, finance does not have to deal with that, even though there might be a financial aspect of the organization, or let's say if you are going to be on the ERP system, and I don't know if ERP system is going to work for these interactions in the government and not-for-profit space. And that's where I feel that the government and not-for-profit organizations, they're slightly different overall from the enterprise architecture perspective. So talk to us about your experience in different components of the enterprise architecture, evolution of different companies, how they sort of evolve, and how that enterprise architecture is going to evolve in the government and not-for-profit space.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I learned more recently in my work in my current role is, I mentioned we've been going through a pretty significant transformation. We experienced, our organization is over 30 years old, but in the last 10 years, we experienced a significant period of growth. And that growth led us to, we had systems that were designed prior to that growth. And so they've run their course. We now need to, we've reanalyzed them. We looked through and said, okay, like this is designed siloed applications designed for an organization half our size.
Yeah.
How do we build new integrated stuff? So that started and prompted me to look through my journey, or start a new journey with us, I should say, through enterprise architecture. So we brought in a gentleman who actually specialized in enterprise architecture, who's become a really great colleague of mine, and really a professional friend of mine that I enjoy working with immensely. And he introduced me to a lot of the concepts of enterprise architecture and what they are. So, building your operating models and understanding how your underlying your underlying organization functions to build out things like your target state architectures, and then create the heat maps of like where you stand on for the different technologies that you need to build the functions that you have. One of the things that I did find really interesting about that journey with him, as I learned about all these, this I'll call it the new terminology that here, hey, look, let's do. Let's go ahead and build an operating model. Here's the diagram that I came up with after interviewing and talking about your organization, or here's the target state architecture. Well, I actually was doing a lot of that stuff before, and this is so I emphasize this to a lot of folks that I talk to, is that you're ultimately doing a lot of enterprise architecture work. If you're an IT leader, you're almost certainly doing a certain amount of enterprise architecture work. You don't even know it, and what I mean by that is, let's say at the county. So at the county, we had a prescribed way we set up our computer systems, and so we had uniformity, and we could deploy them to different departments and stuff with their own software. But each department in like a county function typically has its own vertical software that does the work. The county clerk software is very different than the public safety software that's needed to do 911 dispatching, and each one has their own verticals and their own separate systems. But you still need to figure out how to run them as a group while still maintaining a certain level of separation. So what do you bring in? What tools do they want? The county clerk people come over and say, you know what, we need to use, Box to share files or something like that. And then the sheriff's department comes over and says, hey, you know what, we want to use, Dropbox instead. So a super simple example, but who tells them no? And I don't mean not to make the IT the Department of No, but who ultimately guides them to a common application, a common set of frameworks, a common set of tools. And that's almost certainly the IT leader in the space, whether it's the IT director, the CIO, those types of things, or depending on the size of the organization, maybe a deputy deputy CIO. That's enterprise architecture at the end of the day. In your head, you're hanging on to a target state architecture that defines the applications that you want to see and that are most appropriate in your organization. So for me, that was pretty eject-opening as I really came on this journey with CCSI and worked with a bona fide enterprise architect who had worked at major like healthcare plans and stuff like that. Big organizations building corporate enterprise architectures, but how do you scale that down into an organization? We're a mid-market organization, about 500 staff. So we're a substantial size, but we're not a large business. So, there's a balance to be had about what you can invest in and what you need to spend your time on. But for us, I found that doing the work to build those tools in advance and bringing in some other things like we relied on a number of pieces from Scaled Agile framework, which is things like value stream maps and lean value canvases, and building some epic hypothesis statements for a lot of the work, or a lot of the tools and functions that we wanted to work on, which really was a translation from software development, because a lot of the Scaled Agile framework is really focused on software development lifecycle. So we were reapplying a lot of that into the work that we were doing to identify our enterprise corporate system. So this could range from the ERP to the CRM to the workforce management to the learning and development systems. So an LMS, a learning management system, any of those types of things all fall into this bucket. And how do you create a system that the end goal is to work together seamlessly? And there's a couple of different approaches you could do and what you value. So in our case, we placed a high value on interoperability and simplicity of integration between the components. And that's in part from our own experience that we found as a mid-market organization. In our prior iteration, before we had, so if you go back about 10, 12 years in our organization, they had only just started to hire internal IT, when we were only about, 150, 200 staff. And they had an outsourced IT setup. So when that stuff started to come in, they were still at a point where a lot of the things were chosen by the respective departments or divisions. Finance did their own evaluation, decided that they liked X product. So then they turned around to IT and said, well, we chose, Microsoft Great Plains, please implement it. And, the HR went around and said, okay, well, we evaluated, 4 different payroll systems, and here's the one we liked, so please go implement that. And then eventually, in between those 2 periods, so the period when they chose all those applications and the period when I came on board, they went through a period of having some leaders who were software developers. And there was this philosophy of, we can integrate them. This is the software developer solution to the problem is we could build software to fix this, right? So, and I'm not knocking it. It was, there's a lot of sophisticated work going on here, but but it's a choice, so you make a choice in how you want to tackle the problem that you're facing.
Yeah.
And in that case, at the time that the individual was there, the hammer in their tool belt was software development. So the nail became, let's develop some tools for this. And so that's what the hammer went after. And, by the time I started, we had these siloed tools that had a lot of integration components between them. So there'll be a tool that does the exports and automatically carries it in from the HR system, does an export and imports that into Azure and creates the user accounts and then kicks out to something else and makes a ticket somewhere. And that stuff works. That, I'm not saying that's not how you can do it. But when you're in the mid-market, what we found is that you could build the tool, but you couldn't build the way to monitor how when it breaks. So like what'll happen is it'll work and then something will not work. And then it'll take a day or two before somebody kind of notices and is like, hey, you know what? I haven't gotten a notice that there was new user accounts created like 2 days ago. I was expecting that. And, we'd go in, oh yeah, this thing wasn't working right and stuff. And, so getting back to the size of mid-market and what you can invest in our case, what we found was that we were good at investing in the front end of the work to make the tool function, but not the monitoring components, because that was more money. That was another investment on top of what you put in to make it work. So then we changed our focus to make a prioritization on components that were integrated together. And we, so like we might take fewer bells and whistles, but prioritize the integration of the tools together, because that will actually make them more useful for the parts of the tools that we do have. So like, standardizing on, an Office 365 platform, and which in our case, that's where we were in the Azure platform. But, there's the Google, the G Suite platform, and there's multiple others out there that you can focus on as well. But what do you build the foundation on, and where do you prioritize the interoperability? So in our case, like we made high prioritization of the interoperability in order to maximize the value of the investments that we were making going forward.
Yeah, so very interesting. So, there are so many different directions that we can go in that comment. There are so many layers that we can peel. So I'll offer some commentary, and then I'm pretty sure you are going to have some follow-ups there, right? So number one aspect that you mentioned, and in the space that we work in, they just don't have as much maturity overall, right? I did mention that, for them, they are simply buying a package software.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, they don't necessarily understand what enterprise architecture is.
For sure.
And you did mention that, everybody is doing some version of enterprise architecture. They have to figure it out. They have to make sure that these systems are going to communicate somehow. Sometimes they do communicate, sometimes they don't communicate, and that's where I guess you are going to have a lot of challenges, right? The other thing that you mentioned is finance, HR. These guys are sort of deciding, okay, I have already liked some sort of software, and then now you as the IT guy is probably trying to sort of integrate and bring them together. And in my personal experience, when you are going to do that,
like, hey, we did all the work and picked it. You weren't at the table, but please make it work.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, that could become a huge constraint in my personal experience, and people sort of oversimplify when they think about the integration. So the way you are talking about, hey, simplicity interoperability of these systems. But if you look at this more from the coding perspective, development perspective, things are still easier. And the reason why it's easier is there are a million ways of integrating. Okay, whether you are doing real time, near real time, after the fact. In your case, you are probably, when you are simply exporting a file, after that, so you are sort of handing off the process. In that case, it's sort of the after the fact interaction. And in your case, you did mention that, hey, I didn't have monitoring. But for me personally, let's say if I'm the CFO or a person who cares for the control when the transaction is being processed, I've already lost it. Okay, I don't have any way of controlling that. I have no way of reconciling that, right? So this is not going to be just the technical perspective, it's also the business perspective that matters for these integrations. And when you are already going to decide that, okay, this is the software that I'm going to buy, and you IT guy, you go ahead and now somehow bring it together. So I don't know, I spoke a lot. Do you have any follow-ups there?
Yeah, so for me, one thing that was recommended to me, I have it here. I'll hold it up. But this is an older book, but it's Enterprise Architecture as Strategy, which
Yep.
is a really kind of a classic book in the space of enterprise architecture. And to be honest, I actually just take the first chapter and I ask people to read it. And now the book is from 2006. Enterprise architecture as a practice, I would say, achieved there was a peak and a valley that came with it. So your first peak was in the mid to late 2000s. This idea, we got these businesses, we're going to do this work with enterprise architecture, but then Agile came along, and Agile came along and kind of wrecked the idea of enterprise architecture in certain ways, because enterprise architecture, if you think it through of why you're doing it, it's conceptually it slows things down a step, because it's like, hey, we're gonna pause. We're going to think about what we want to do. We're going to come up with a plan for it. And then we're going to work against the plan with a set of reference tools that we can come back to later to know, like, check ourselves. Like, does this make sense? This is what we thought about. This is what we wanted. And in Agile, that's not often how Agile works. Agile is about, let's sprint through this. Let's come up with an idea and let's go after it fast and let's go to it. So the 2010s saw, I think, a really diminishment of the idea of enterprise architecture. And now I really think in the last 2 or 3, maybe even 4 years, you've seen a resurgence of interest in the concepts of it, and a melding of the concepts of Agile. How do we implement something and implement the tools in an Agile way? But let's pause and let's think hard about why we want to do something. Because like, having a seat at the table for IT, and of course this is self-serving. I'm an IT leader. I think I should be at every table. But the truth of the matter is that, at least as I see it, and my experience that I've been shared from colleagues that I work with, is that when you bring me in as the IT leader, your outcome is often better.
Yeah.
So like having that IT leader sit with you and walk through the space, especially one who understands the intersections between the business side of it and the IT side of it. Somebody who can sit there and say, you know what, this makes sense from a business perspective, but this won't integrate with anything else we're doing on a technical side. So like, even though it's the best piece of software out there in this space, you're going to struggle to move your information around with the other systems that you have, or we're going to end up spending, 25% of the cost of the software package just building integrations to make it communicate with everything else that we have. So, thinking through those, like that ultimately becomes that is the savings, and it's hard because it's hard to get credit for, not driving the car off the cliff, like, hey, okay, great. People don't see that you did it when it happens. And there is a high value to that. And it's, it's a lot of relationship building. It's a lot of, building empathy with folks, building the trust of your organizations. When I started, small anecdote here is that, like, I started at the county, and the IT prior to me was a little more old school IT. My predecessor was one of the ones who helped build the aforementioned AS400 system and stuff. So they came from a very different mentality about how IT was supposed to function and why. And when we would have an outage, like, so I was like 6 weeks in, and we had multiple buildings, and we had our own fiber strung between the utility poles between the buildings, and a squirrel chews one of them. So all of a sudden, there's the public safety building where the sheriff's office is and stuff. They're offline. And we have a process to repair this. We call a firm and do all these other things.
Yeah.
And it's probably a couple hours before they can get there and splice the fiber back together. And I get a call from the sheriff's, the secretary of the sheriff's office,
Yeah.
and so the sheriff's secretary is like, "Oh, this is Diane, the sheriff's secretary."
Yeah.
The sheriff wants you to give him hourly reports on how this is going and what's going on, and so like they have no faith that anybody's doing anything worthwhile. They demand all this, so they start making all these demands.
Yeah.
And that was when I started. But when I left, I remember about 6 months before I left, we had a car hit a telephone pole. Unfortunately, nobody was hurt in the car. The telephone pole was quite hurt, and the telephone pole was busted in half, and our fiber was ripped down. And we put out the appropriate notice to all our staff. We let them know. That was number one. Number two, we had some level of backup at that point. It made it a little easier, and we were able to transition. But there was still some downtime.
Yeah.
And even when there was downtime, they called. They're like, the tone of how we were communicated with was totally different at that point. It was, "Hey, we're sure you know about this, and we're sure you're working on it, but we just wanted to confirm that there's an outage at the sheriff's office." And we're like, "Yeah, there is. We're working on it. Here's the thing. We'll call you, give you an update." They're like, "Okay, thanks. Please let us know when it's done." And so like the night and day difference from start to finish. Defines the relationship that, to me, like exemplifies the value of building that relationship and building the trust. And then that translates into them calling you as an IT leader to come to the table and say, "You know what, we're looking at this new tool and we'd like you to sit at the table with us." Not because you're going to take it over or you're going to tell us no or you're going to do all these other things, but because having you here is going to drive huge amounts of value for what we're doing. And even in the government space, there's a lot of positive impact from that.
Yeah, so very interesting story there, and I absolutely enjoyed that, to be completely honest, because I've seen that too, and especially for people who may not have done as much IT technology, this is going to be substantial fear in their mind in general. In terms of, okay, am I sort of handing over the control, and if I'm not going to get the updates, then I'm probably going to have some challenges here. But going back to your comment related to agile as well as enterprise architecture, so let's touch a little bit more on that, okay? And there was and I don't know if this is a misunderstanding, misconception, and you can tell us more, right? There was no sort of overlap between these two. The way they were done, I think it was the implementation practice, because of which I think people sort of got confused about the how these two things can be done together. Obviously there are a million ways of doing agile. There are a million ways of doing enterprise architecture as well. You can overload the whole process of agile. You can overload the process of enterprise architecture as well, but you can also make the whole effort of enterprise architecture agile as well, right? And that is where I guess people don't sort of understand that. And sometimes they are sort of overthinking the whole aspect of enterprise architecture. And they feel that if they are going to develop these components, and sometimes, even with agile, the whole philosophy was that you have to deliver business value. And business value needs to be communicated, needs to be realized, needs to be understood. You have to build the consensus. You can't create something and then figure out how that is going to work in the overarching picture. So that was my understanding. But then when people start implementing, and then they have their own versions of how these things need to be implemented, and it's sort of all over the place. That's my experience. So I know I spoke a lot. Do you have any follow-ups on agile versus enterprise architecture?
Yeah, so I would. It's funny. I wrote down a note while you were talking, and the note that I wrote down is, "You go slow to go fast." So. Yep. So the idea here is that agile, different people can have differing opinions, of course. So your mileage may vary. In my experience, the pause that you take to merge together agile delivery methods with enterprise architecture's core tenets is that you pause up front and make some level of investment to make sure that you have a good check to understand, what are we coming back to? And that's because take, for instance, my current enterprise application development strategy. We currently have 4 different major applications with different implementation teams going at the same time. So we ultimately selected NetSuite
Yeah.
as our core, the core of our system. But NetSuite is an integrated tool. It's ERP, it's CRM,
Yeah.
it's the HR function, it's the payroll function, all in one. So we're implementing them in pieces, but that means that at different points, you've got a lot of different stuff happening with different teams. How do you keep them together? So like
Yeah.
Agile is going to help us execute the steps of each one of those implementations. We're gonna, they'll do, whether they call it a sprint or not, but it's functionally what they do. They do a little bit of development time. They come back, they talk to us, we give them feedback, we go back again. So those are really sprints and reviews. But how do I know that this project and this project and this project, so project A, B, and C,
Yeah.
are integrated with each other and will end up in the same place?
Yeah.
So in a traditional agile environment, they're pretty much just independently functioning things.
Yeah.
So somebody has to keep track of how they're going and how they fit together in the long run. So to me, that's where the intersection with enterprise architecture comes in, is because I can start at the beginning and I can say, this is the goal that we had. And another piece that enterprise architecture really helps with, in my opinion, is helping find a defensible way to specify why we're making choices and not let the choice of the moment rule the day. So like people get wowed by some big, like fancy presentation from a bunch of salespeople on this tool. Like, take a learning management. We're going to be like, in our organization, we're going to be looking at a learning management system soon to replace one of the ones we have. And I'm going to, per our enterprise architecture, it should highly and tightly integrate with one of the tools that we have. So that'll become either the Azure Stack and Microsoft's like Viva platform and stuff like that, or it'll be NetSuite. So there's really 2 options there, but we're going to look at the tools, only the tools that integrate those. And the enterprise architecture is defining that how and what we're going to, it creates like, the enterprise architecture is like the guardrails on the road.
Yeah.
And then the agile is how we drive down the road.
Yeah, could not agree more. So let's touch some more on that. And I think there's a little confusion there. And you made a very interesting point there, from the ERP perspective. And this is probably going to be the confusion, among a lot of folks that are going to be from the ERP community. In general, when you look at it, and I don't know how this implementation was, to be completely honest. But overall, when you look at the ERP, one of the controlling factor or the driving factor from the ERP perspective is the tightness of the data model. And sometimes that tightness of the data model, what it does is you cannot implement these pieces independently. In your case, you mentioned that, you are implementing finance separately.
We're experiencing exactly that right now.
My ERP guys are saying that, what the hell is happening here? That's not possible. How do you do that? So because the constraints are really from the data model perspective, if the data model is going to be embedded, and if you have those controls and the financial controls that are going to be enforced at the data level, and that's where you are going to get the data integrity, etc., in your model, and that's why you sort of implement ERP. Otherwise, why do you need an ERP to begin with, right? So let's say if somebody is doing a little bit of ERP and they want to operate independently across these functions. Number one, is that possible? How would you approach that, I guess, and how you have approached in your engagement? So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in our case, we have thought hard about which ones are yoked to one another. So for instance, we can't. When we did ours in phases, or we're planning ours in phases. We're currently in our phase 1 and starting our phase 2. So we're at the back end of our phase 1 implementation and overlapping with starting our phase 2 design session work. But there are certain functions that you have to be mindful of how they interact with each other, and then what the investment is, or the consequence is of implementing certain things at certain times. So in our case, for example, we're going live on like our HR and our payroll systems, but we're not going live on our timekeeping system. And that's because the ERP component, when we actually switch our core finance software from our current platform into NetSuite, that doesn't happen until phase 2. So if we moved our timekeeping system over, our timekeeping system is linked pretty closely, and the integrations are all built with our current finance system. So then you would have to rebuild integrations with really back to an old finance system, only to then redo the integrations into the new NetSuite product. So you have to give consideration to the sequencing of how these things work together and how they interact with each other. Because some of them are like the data constraints of having this tool that has all this data in it. And if that's your source of truth, you can't have two sources of truth. So you have to figure out a way to synchronize the one, if you've picked a new source of truth, how does that source of truth, the information from that source of truth, move to the other systems? Exactly. Maybe those used to be your source of truth in the past, but now you got to invest in those in those integrations. So in our case, like by carefully planning the sequencing out from start to finish, and that doesn't mean we don't adapt, because we have adapted as we've gone along. So we come through, maybe an assumption we made early on was not accurate, or we were like, oh, we're going to be able to move, like time clocking actually is a great example. We are intending to use like NetSuite's time clocking features, which is like punch in and punch out. Yeah. And which is different than time tracking, like billable time tracking. Yeah. In this case, we could go live on time clocking, but then we'd have two systems. Yeah. And we'd have to build new integrations to keep that second system going, or bring the data that we're generating in NetSuite back into an old system. Or we could just wait a few months and let it go live with the new ERP when that goes live as well. So, I think to answer your question at a high level, you really have to give consideration to what those intersections are. You have to be mindful of the platform that you're choosing, or platforms, how they integrate. You really have to think hard about what is your source of truth, and when does that source of truth change? Because that's an important distinction too. Because like you're on source of truth A and you need to move to source of truth B. You have to figure out when that happens and what the consequences of it are.
Yeah, could not agree more. Great discussion, and we can probably go on for hours here. Obviously, Doug, you know a lot. Okay, but we are close to our time right now, so I don't know if you're going to have any sort of closing advice, for the CIOs who may not have done as much work, or maybe CFOs, they might not have a CIO like you. So, what would be your closing advice for them?
To me, I would say that for CIOs and directors, one of the things that's most important is to think hard about being understanding of the business and what the most successful IT leaders, and when I interview on the podcast that I'm on, all the most successful versions of those leaders are the ones that know their business that they work for and know how to be a translator between the two. So being knowledgeable in your IT space, but being able to talk to the people that are not, and not have them feel, have them feel that there's a high value to that conversation. That really is one of the secret weapons to being a highly effective CIO and IT leader.
Could not agree more. Great advice, Doug. Once again, thank you so much for your time. So that's it for the episode for today. If you joined for the first time, this was part of our interview series, for which we meet every Friday between 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern. So make sure you guys, check our future episodes as well. We are going to have a lot of guests lined up. On that note, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you so much, Doug, once again for your insights and time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Of course.